Welcome to the Essential Geopolitics podcast from Stratfor, a RANE company. This is your essential guide to major geopolitical developments and how they affect you and your business. I'm Emily Donahue. In this podcast, the U.S. relationship with China and how it is changing with Rodger Baker, Senior Vice President for Strategic Analysis. Rodger, thanks for being our guide today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Rodger, the Defense Department recently released its annual report to Congress on developments regarding the Chinese military and the rapid growth of the Chinese Navy. Can we talk a little bit about the significance of that?
Sure. I mean, the report emphasizes right at the beginning that the Chinese Navy is now the largest Navy in the world. It's got a battle force of about 350 ships and submarines compared to the U.S. 293 ships. So that has raised a lot of concern in the United States as to the idea that the Chinese have a much narrower geography to deal with in regards to the size of their Navy than the U.S. does. That does significantly start to alter the balance of power within the West Pacific region. We've also seen recent reports come out emphasizing the Chinese overtaking the capacity and capability of the Japanese Navy as well. So as we look at developments in the Western Pacific, in the Asia Pacific, in regards to political power, which translates into economic power and economic relationships, clearly the Chinese naval buildup has been reshaping the structure of that region.
So, Rodger, how does China's naval buildup reshape dynamics in the entire Asia Pacific region?
Well, when we look at this, one, it really does alter the question for countries in the region as to whether or not the United States is still the most important partner there. So as you think about relations in East Asia, over the past, say, 10 years or more, it's really been a split between economic relations with China, defense and security relations with the United States. But we've seen countries start to question whether or not that dual relationship is still of benefit. The Philippines is a great case in point, where they have shifted their relationship with the United States on the defense and security side, recognizing that the economic benefits from China outweigh the potential U.S. security benefits, particularly when they haven't seen the United States take action on key aspects of what they consider to be their national security, like the disposition of their islands. South Korea looks at this dynamic as well. So as we watch the balance for political power, economic influence within that region, and alliances and partnerships, the stronger and more capable the Chinese Navy, the more it eats away at the confidence that the United States is going to be that most important partner. And therefore, countries become more likely to side with China or to try to continue to straddle that line between the United States and China.
Rodger, I can't help but be reminded of the buildup in the South China Sea not so many years ago, in which the world watched and countries like the Philippines made statements that it was a problem, and yet China was able to do that without any international sanction.
Yes, the Chinese have been able to expand in the South China Sea because the perception from the United States was that each individual action by China was not large enough to risk a major confrontation with China by the United States. And that allowed the Chinese to eat away slice by slice, piece by piece. Some people like to call it the salami slicing strategy, to reshape the region. China is now firmly ensconced on several artificial islands within the South China Sea. Those islands may be vulnerable in times of war, but in everything shy of war, those islands exert power and influence. And the Chinese are using that to broaden their claim on territorial waters. And the United States this year only finally came out with a very clear statement on their view of China's claims, declaring that they view many of these Chinese claims as illegitimate based on a court ruling several years ago. And that's now putting the United States and the Chinese at clear odds. And one of the things we're watching for is whether some of these Southeast Asian nations, like Vietnam, for example, start to assert themselves even stronger against China and require the United States to back up its new stated position that it will consider Chinese interference, for example, in Vietnamese waters as a violation of international law.
We're talking about Chinese naval power. China's long been a continental power, with 14 different countries along its land borders. How do these land security pressures relate to China's naval expansion?
Well, this is the real interesting challenge for China. China, throughout its history, has primarily been continental. It's really focused on the land areas. There's been a few moments in Chinese history, particularly when power was in the south, that China had a maritime component, but for the most part, it hasn't. China is now emerging as a truly amphibious power, as a great power that has both a major continental component and an expanding maritime component. It's pushing beyond the South China Sea. It's pushed into the Indian Ocean, further into the South Pacific, starting to look at moving up into the Arctic. So this is a real change in how we see China behave, but also a real change in the pressures and responsibilities. A country that is continental has a certain way of looking at the world, looking at relations. Continental powers are more often going to be autocratic, going to be very centralized. Maritime powers are more often going to be leaning potentially toward democratic. They're really built on commerce and international trade and international norms. So this is creating an interesting cognitive dissonance inside Chinese leadership and how to manage those two worlds. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to straddle these two, both to look at the continental land connections into Eurasia and to look at the maritime space. But I think that that's going to be the really interesting defining characteristic of the next decade or so in watching China. How does China balance in this new amphibious nature?
Rodger Baker is Senior Vice President for Strategic Analysis at Stratfor, a RANE company. Rodger's must-read columns on China's geopolitical rise and what happens next can be found at Stratfor Worldview. Check out the special price for podcast listeners at stratfor.com/podcast offer. That's all one word, stratfor.com/podcast offer. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.